Welcome back, everyone, to the Cathedral of St. John Berchmans and another adult faith formation opportunity. This is part one of 2 parts of our summer program. And we're going to hear, as you see on the screen, all about the Middle Ages. Dr. Cheryl White will speak to us about something that is really near and dear to her heart. In fact, as I think many of you know, I recently was on a pilgrimage with her, as in just a couple of weeks ago, and were able to see so much of medieval England, medieval Wales as well. But thank you for being here today, and I really hope that this in some way inspires you. The more we get to know about our faith and the history of our church, the more we should fall in love even more deeply regarding our faith. So thank you, Dr. White, for offering a midsummer course on the medieval church.
Thank you. Make sure I have all of my equipment working here this morning. Someone walk off with my,
Is this it?
Did I leave my clicker? I leave things in random places. It's just personality defect. Okay, so thank you for coming this morning. I do want to point out to everyone before we get started that on the back table back there, we have these booklets that give you the schedule for fall. Our theme for fall for adult faith formation is going to be called Catholic Foundations, and the schedule is in the center of this booklet. There's also, of course, everything for CCD as well. The schedule for the God and Sex series. So be sure you pick one of those up in the back before you leave today. Okay, so I thought myself very clever for having called this 2-part series Midsummer Middle Ages, and I thought it was so clever. You know, it makes this nice alliteration, Midsummer Middle Ages. And then it occurred to me after I'd already published the title that this isn't really midsummer at all. So I do want to explain to you sort of what I was thinking about that. However, I had the idea in mind that midsummer, where most of us feel like we are in the middle of July, is actually a little bit earlier than this. But we know that midsummer is something that was a point of transition, that ancient pre-Christian people would mark as a festival on their lunar calendar, would mark this as a time of celebration, because we would be coming out of a period of planting in early summer, and then of course the next major event in the community life, the village life, would then be the harvest that came in the fall. And so midsummer offered an opportunity for these ancient, again, pre-Christian peoples to stop and reflect on the transition that was going on in their village and their community as they began to look forward to the next major event in the life of their community together, which would be the harvest. Everyone came together for the harvest. So we don't know a lot about that particular festival. We know that, for instance, the ancient Celts of the British Isles and the Celts that lived in Gaul, what is today modern-day France, and Belgium and parts of Central Europe, all observed something called Lughnasadh. We don't know a lot about the festival except that it was a point of transition. For our purposes, though, I think it's equally important, or perhaps more important in our context, to know that for the medieval church, really beginning in the early Middle Ages, in the 6th century, they took this idea of midsummer, and you find it even, of course, expressed in medieval social histories that villages would celebrate midsummer. Some of you may know there's a rather famous Shakespeare play by the name of Midsummer Night's Dream. So it is this pervasive idea. The difference being that on the Christian calendar in the 6th century, the decision was made to create a feast around the time of the summer solstice, much like the pagan midsummer. But around the time of the summer solstice, of course, we see June 24th is the feast of John the Baptist. And what appears to have happened is the church backed up 6 months from Christmas, and this is the feast that again marks a transition, because remember, the significance here would be that it is John the Baptist who is preparing the way for the Christ. So in both of these contexts, in both the pre-Christian and in the Christian medieval context, Midsummer marks a transition. A transition having value in and of itself, not necessarily the event we're looking forward to, but the transition itself is seen as significant and relevant as sort of a point of reflection and meditation. So that's totally where I was going with that, Midsummer, Middle Ages. And then it occurred to me, of course, this is July 15th, and Midsummer was about 3 weeks ago. So many of us still do have, at least I do, I don't know about you, but I have at least another month of summer vacation left. So it is kind of a midsummer thing for me. All right, so what I wanted to do here in these next two sessions, and all of that, by the way, was to point out that my choice of title was incorrect, historically inaccurate, and I hope you'll forgive me for the misnomer. But it is a good time for us to come back together at this point in the summer and think about the fall. So the inspiration for what I want to do actually came from both a recent journey that I took and a major research project that I am now working on. And so I want to frame this really this week looking more at the inspiration for the actual talk that I will give next week, looking at a recent journey in April that I took. Some of you may know that Father Peter and I spent some time, and it's been a few days, in the Vatican Secret Archives looking at a very specific period in the 13th century. It was actually my second visit. I was given access there in 2015 to look at something completely unrelated from the early modern period, the 16th century in England. But perhaps the most critical thing that really came out of this most recent visit is still developing, still very much developing. We are working on a finding with some medievalists from a major a major American university that is something we hope to publish soon. So more on that later. I couldn't tell you now because it's highly classified, and I'd have to kill you all. So can't do that. But it is at this point, it's very exciting and very promising research that I'm working on right now. And I want to divide the series this way. Again, looking at the Vatican Secret Archives today, and next week using specific sources from those archives to look at the rich culture, art, and history of the Middle Ages, which can really only be told, and I cannot overstate this, that the history of the Middle Ages can really only be told because of this rich depository that the Church has in the Vatican archives. So we're going to talk a little more about those specifics next week. Like every archive in the world, there are two major parts to this. Two major parts that would be visible to you if you were ever admitted there. And I know that Father Peter did a little bit about the Vatican Secret Archives back in the spring before we dismissed for summer. But I want to show you some photographs and talk a little more about some of the collections, the holdings there, specific holdings, and how we might use those in our exploration of the Middle Ages. But you have the stacks, like you do in every library, right? The stacks where everything is kept. And you have a reading room. In the case of the Vatican Secret Archives, though, there is also, sort of adding to the intrigue, is that there is an underground bunker at the Vatican Secret Archives that I have not seen, but I have verified is there. This bunker is where the Vatican actually keeps the most fragile of the documents, including, for instance, an early compilation of the canon of Scripture called the Codex Vaticanus, which is in very fragile condition, along with other early medieval parchments and scrolls that cannot be digitized or duplicated in any way that will preserve them. So it's one of those cases where there are parchments and scrolls that if they were unrolled to duplicate or to scan could actually damage the document itself. So those documents are kept in a secret part of the secret archives, the more secret part of the secret archives, where in case of a catastrophe they would be saved. Everything else in the major collection is in the process being scanned and digitized. There's a great effort going on there to do that today. So I did not see the underground bunker, and if Father Peter got to see it, he did not share that with me. So I want to give you just a tiny little look inside, okay? This is actually a photograph of nothing but indices. These are indexes to the letters and papers of popes, various popes. These are the indexes that you have to go to find the documents that you want, that you can then request by folio. This is a slide of some of the stacks. You can see where they keep some of these documents in the bowels of this massive building. Here's an interesting picture looking down a hallway in the stacks that gives you some sense of maybe the depth of this, the length of this. Now, I have to stop and say something, lest any of you think that I would ever take an illegal photo. Not here, I didn't, no. These are actually public photographs that have an interesting story behind them. I don't know how many of you remember the novels by Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons. But when those works were published, there was such a swirl of controversy about some of the allegations that Dan Brown made in his books, The Secrets that the Vatican was keeping from all of us, that in response to that, the archives actually opened up to journalists. There were AP journalists, about 20 of them, who were permitted to come in, and they took photographs. They were allowed to photograph many things in the collection. And as a matter of fact, there are 100 documents that were made public, completely public. Anybody can see them. You don't have to have access to the archives to get them. They are publicly available. And it was a way, I think, an effort for the church to minimize the use of the word secret, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But there was such a swirl of controversy. All of these photographs you're going to see are public. I took no illegal photographs that I'm going to share with you. Okay? Yeah, but these are journalist photos. So, of those 100 images that are available, as I said, I'm going to share some of those with you today. I think both while I was there this time, not so much in 2015, but while I was there this time, and especially after I returned, I really reflected on, because I teach medieval Europe to college students. I struggle to teach medieval Europe to college students. Actually, the students are probably the ones who struggle, not me. But teaching medieval Europe, it occurred to me in a pretty dramatic way after returning from this trip, the towering significance of this particular archive. And I want you to really hear this. Its role in preserving and maintaining the record of the role of the church in human events, the role of the church in human secular affairs even. For some reason, this time I was truly struck by the fact that these archives are more than just a mere depository of information. There are a staggering 52 miles of shelving. Think about that. 52 miles of shelving. If you measured them linearly, in the stacks of materials there containing millions of documents, parchments, scrolls. What some might see, I think, as nothing more than this massive dustbin of the past, and might even question the reason to keep all the clutter. But what I was struck by this particular time, and again, thinking in the context of teaching medieval Europe, is the prominent role that the church has always played, and literally how the church has been present at every single turning of every single page of history. And this is perhaps no more true than the period we call the Middle Ages, which I'll explain to you in just a minute. So I had the idea that the greatest way to frame an exploration of the medieval church the entirety of the medieval church, the entirety of the Middle Ages, which is something, again, I sometimes struggle with to keep organized, is to do so through the record that the church maintains, which is also a great indicator of how integral the church has always been. So I think there's two messages there. When you think about art, culture, and history, from the fall of the Roman Empire, about the year 476, I mark that year because that's the year that the city of Rome actually fell to the barbarians, was in 476. Some might back up and argue that it actually began in the year 410 with the first wave of barbarian incursions that came in. But from the fall of the Western Roman Empire through the end of the 14th century, certainly around the time of 1500, and again, historians don't really agree, and if we did, we'd be an even more boring lot than we already are. But 1517, some mark as the end of the Middle Ages. You might know the significance of that. Marks the year of Luther's protest. Some mark the end of the Middle Ages as 1527, when the city of Rome was again sacked by imperial troops under the command of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. But wherever you mark it, it's 1500-ish. So 476 to 1500-ish, we're talking about 1,000 years. 1,000 years that the church drove all intellectual, artistic, cultural endeavor, every single aspect of the human story. Not only is the church the driver of society, the driver of art and history and culture and intellectual endeavor, this is what's great about it for us. It is the keeper of the record. It is also the keeper of the record. So let's talk about this idea of secret. To get into the Vatican secret archives, can anybody go? No. What would you guess? No. It is very exclusive access, and even everyone properly credentialed is not guaranteed admittance, but they're not truly secret. I think the better word we could use is private. They are private papers. While it's exciting to think about, the name Vatican Secret Archives, secretum actually means more private than it does secret, but it's been translated that way into English. Probably does a lot to connote some negativity, I think, about the church, doesn't it? That somehow there is this attempt to suppress information or to withhold information or to keep it from the general public. And I can tell you that if these archives were truly secret, no one would be admitted, and certainly not university professors whose intent is to publish it and share it. So that word really does not apply. You know, we want to publish and disseminate and tell everybody, well, look what I'm doing this morning. I'm going to tell you all about it, right? But of course, if you've read those novels of Dan Brown's, if you've read The Da Vinci Code, or you read Angels and Demons, you know that the church is keeping all kinds of nasty secrets from us, right? Including some wacky things like maybe they've got evidence of extraterrestrial life that they're not sharing with us. That there's some ancient document that disproves the existence of Jesus, right? That there is some major evidence there that would discredit the entirety of the Christian faith. I mean, there's these incredible conspiracy theories that come out primarily because I think of the use of the word secret to describe these archives instead of private. Are any of those things true, by the way? No. No. Now, are there portions of the archives that are not available to the public? Yes. Yes, there are. And I'll tell you, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the general rule is that anything that is less than 75 less than 75 years old is not going to be accessible. They won't be available. Anything related right now to the archives, the papal archives of Pope Pius XII, are closed to researchers. Why is that? Well, first of all, as I said, as a general rule, material is not available for at least 75 years after the end of that Pope's lifetime. And there is an open cause for his canonization right now. An open cause for his canonization that has been somewhat controversial. Remember that he was Pope between 1939 and 1958, a period that transected both World War II and the Holocaust. And his role, his silence, what some have perceived as his silence in the Holocaust, or his willingness to not directly confront Nazism and fascism in its worst forms, has caused some controversy among some groups. But I think the real reason those archives are closed is because of the 75-year rule. And if you go there, essentially that's what they tell you. You can't see anything after 1939. So it's not just his papacy, obviously. It's Paul VI, and Pope John Paul I, Pope John Paul II. Okay, so what these archives represent is truly the greatest, most vast resource in the entire world for putting together a historical narrative of events. It spans over 12 centuries in completion, in entirety, 12 centuries, with some partial records that are far older than that even. And let me be clear about something. The owner of the archives is not the Roman Catholic Church. The archives are owned by the sitting Pope. And the sitting Pope is the only one who decides what the policies and procedures will be about having access to them. So I thought it might be fun to take a little bit of time this morning and let's just review a handful of the completely world-altering events that are deposited there. And I cannot say this strongly enough. Without the record of which, history could not be written. If the church in the archives had not preserved the things that I am getting ready to tell you, the history of these events could not have even been written. That's how important this role is. Some of these examples I'm going to give you have been digitized. As I said, they've been made available to the public. Still very restrictive about making a lot of materials available to the public, or to anyone really, but academics. But for instance, the correspondence between Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope St. Gregory VII. Some of you, and I know I've got a few students here this morning, some of you remember this from the course in medieval Europe. But this really marked a period in the 11th century. You have this dramatic conflict between an emerging strong imperial office in the Holy Roman Empire and also the emergence of a very strong papacy. And the two men clashed. Pope Gregory VII was, of course, known, his given name was Hildebrand. He was a monk in a small Benedictine monastery in France called Cluny that ended up being the center of a major reform movement of the 10th and 11th centuries. And Hildebrand became Pope St. Gregory VII. So there is preserved in the archives the original letter from the 11th century that the Holy Roman Emperor wrote to the Pope and addressed him this way. From Henry, Emperor, not by usurpation or falsehood, but by the pious ordination of God himself. To Hildebrand, not Pope, but a false monk. A little bit of tension in that relationship? Okay, so the entire history of that epic conflict between those two men could not be written completely in its entirety without the preservation of these documents. Remember that history demands the written record. So yes, that never would have been written without its preservation in those archives. A bull of Pope Innocent III that called for the calling of the Fourth Crusade, which we actually saw when we were there, and the reaction of Pope Innocent III to that crusade when he learned that Christian armies had sacked the city, taken relics, destroyed churches, in a letter in which he calls it, quote, an act of hell itself, end quote. and then issued mass excommunications in response to that. Everybody that he could get the name of was excommunicated in the wake of that Fourth Crusade. Again, a history that couldn't be completely written. Now this, what I'm getting ready to show you is not that bull, okay? It's also not an illegal photograph. It's not that bull. Actually, it's a scan I paid for. But it is, I think, interesting. It's a scan of one of the documents that Father Peter and I are working from. This is actually a letter from Pope Innocent III to King John of England, where he's throwing some shade on the French king, King Philip IV. King Philip II of France. But I show it not really for its historic value, or that I expect anybody here to be able to read this medieval 13th century Latin and translate it, but I show it to you because of its artistic value. Would you not agree? And this is on almost every single page of these medieval transcripts of correspondence. There is a scribe who is apparently quite artistic. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? There's it literally on every single page. As I said, I show it just for its artistic value. So there's also Pope Leo X's 1521 excommunication of Martin Luther. This is a public photograph that the archives made available as part of that 100 they released several years ago. The excommunication of Martin Luther in 1521, well, did that change a few things in history? Right? Again, a history which couldn't be completely written without the preservation of the record. There's a 1530 petition from about 100 English clergy and nobles requesting that Pope Clement VII annul the marriage of Henry VIII. That is preserved in the archives. And I've actually, in my 2015 visit, I not only saw this document, but I was able to hold it. It is a parchment that contains the individual seals and signatures of 85 clergy and nobles of England. It is perfectly preserved. And interestingly, this particular document, you can't really tell what they're held on there with, is little red ribbons. Y'all see these little red ribbons? This particular document is thought to be the origin of the term we use, red tape. Right? Government red tape comes from this particular document. Now, obviously, Clement VII refused, of course, the annulment, and the rest, as we say, is history. A year after Columbus landed in North America, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull called Inter Cetera. And in this papal bull, what he did was divide the lands of the New World between Portugal and Spain. And let me tell you why that's important. It's not kings, and it's not world leaders, it's not nation leaders who decide and define the political and geopolitical boundaries of the New World. It is a pope who does that. It is a pope who does that. And again, preserved in this archive in Rome. We have the very last letter that was ever written by Mary, Queen of Scots, to Pope Sixtus V, about 2 months before her execution, begging for her life. And for those of you that don't know the background of that, just real quickly, Mary, Queen of Scots was the Catholic Queen of Scotland who tried to assert her claim to the throne of England as well during the time of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth being a Protestant, Mary Stuart being a Catholic, she believed she could demonstrate that she had a stronger and more viable claim to the throne, which in fact arguably she did. She was of legitimate descent. Elizabeth I was of illegitimate descent. But this is the last letter from her to the Pope pleading for her life. And as far as we know, as far as we can tell, Sixtus V never answered her. This was written in late 1586, and she was executed in England on February 8th of 1586. So 1587, just a few months later. The archives also hold some diverse historical letters from diverse historical figures. Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Think about that. Who both wrote to Pope Pius IX to defend their positions in the Great War against the states. Abraham Lincoln writes to insist that his cause is just, it's righteous, because he's preserving the unity and union, right, of the federal union, and that his cause is righteous. Jefferson Davis writing at almost the same time to the same Pope to assert that his cause is righteous because the South is victim of Northern aggression and unmerited, unwarranted, and completely unprovoked hostility. And why is that interesting to us? Neither of these men were Catholic. Why are they writing to the Pope? Why do they care what the church says or thinks? Well, I think, again, the answer is in the fact that these men knew the church had been present at every turning of the page of history. And the Pope was seen as a world leader. He was seen as someone of influence, even to non-Catholic heads of state. Okay. There are famous trial transcripts that are held here. Here's a signature you might recognize. Y'all see that? Y'all see that at the bottom? Can you read it sideways? Anybody want to guess who that is? Galileo Galilei. It's his signature on his trial transcript, his confession. That's held, again, the complete trial transcript of which is held in the early 17th century, is held in these archives. The trial of the Templars from 1314. This marks the time when King Philip IV of France tried to suppress the order. Actually, didn't try to, he did suppress the order of the Knights Templar. The last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was executed, burned at the stake, along with several other Templars. The Templar treasure was seized, the order was suppressed, and then this trial transcript went missing for 700 years. Okay? So what do we naturally think? What do we naturally think? They're hiding something, right? Because of all the mystique surrounding the Templars, all the mystique of the order itself, the secrets they had, famously promoted again by a particular novelist we're all familiar with. So everyone believed that the church had suppressed this information. And then in 2007, Vatican research, and I can't imagine having been this person, went to ask for a folio, related, unrelated, completely unrelated, something else, and she was given a file, and within this file she found the record of the Templars, the trial. It was not suppressed, it was not hidden, it was misfiled. It was misfiled. So again, in response to a swirl of controversy, and I think in a way to try to show the world the church was not hiding this from you. There's nothing in this document to hide. Yeah, these men burned at the stake. We're sorry. Pope Clement V actually absolved them of heresy after they had already burned. So this was not a matter of correcting the church's mistake. It was simply misfiled. It was a clerical error. It's a clerical error. So in response to that, the church issued some 700 something limited edition prints of this so-called Chinon collection. It's called Chinon because this particular parchment was signed by Pope Clement V at Chinon Palace in northern France. And they issued the entire collection, limited edition prints, as I said, about 700 of them, of which Norton Art Gallery has one in their library. I don't know that they make it available to the public, but if you go into the library and ask to see it, they might let you. Don't tell them I sent you, no. But I'm sure that Lewis Norton would not have purchased one, would not have acquired one if he did not intend to share it with people. So when Sweden's Queen Christina abdicated Actually, I cut off part of this. I don't know why. My apologies. No, that's not the one I wanted to show you. Never mind. I'm not getting to him yet. When Sweden's Queen Christina abdicated the throne in 1654, Sweden being a very heavily Lutheran country, she renounced her Lutheranism and converted to Catholicism, and she wrote a letter, of course, to the Pope announcing both her abdication and her conversion to Catholicism. This was kind of a shocking event for northern Protestant Europe, that a queen would abdicate and convert to Catholicism. She moved to live in Rome. As a matter of fact, Queen Christina of Switzerland is one of only a handful of women who are buried in St. Peter's Basilica. Her original letter that she wrote to Pope Alexander VII is preserved in these archives. Again, in that letter relating a lot of personal detail that would otherwise be unknown to historians, had these archives not preserved that for us. A favorite example of mine is the one I accidentally skipped to here. This is a letter to Pope Julius II, written by none other than Michelangelo Buonarroti. And he's writing, complaining about having not been paid for his work in the Sistine Chapel, and threatening that if he does not get paid, he's quitting. And oh, by the way, all of your Sistine Chapel guards have not been paid either, and they're going to quit too. So, famous, of course, for his temper. If you know anything at all about the personality of Michelangelo, you know that this is completely fitting with what we know about his personality, just telling the Pope, pay me or I'm fired. Or, I'm quitting. You're fired, I'm quitting. Okay, there's also there's ironic things that you might find there. For instance, a document called the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. There's Christina's letter. Sorry, I had those out of order. Did y'all want me to do that again, or can you just sort of like that in your mind? Okay, had those out of order, my apologies. The Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. I don't know if you can recognize this signature down here, who that might be. Okay, so what's ironic about this Defense of the Seven Sacraments ends up being the most well-written, most logically argued, point-by-point refutation of the teachings of Martin Luther. And it was drafted in 1521 by young Renaissance king Henry VIII. It is an ardent support of the papacy. It's 1521. And again, this is a document that I actually have seen myself. All right, so yeah, all of this is fascinating stuff. Can we agree this is all fascinating stuff? And these are things, again, without which history could not have been written in its entirety as we know it today. But this is hardly the stuff of Dan Brown novels, is it? It's really not. Pope Innocent III, late 12th, early 13th century. Now his papacy is 1198 to 1216. That's the time period we're talking about. Pope Innocent III is the first pope to have seen the need to bring documents together that had been collected through the centuries. His papacy is actually the first one to be very comprehensively documented, and it is, of course, in his papers that I'm spending a lot of time right now. Then it was Pope Paul V in about the year 1612 who decided that the archives needed to be formally organized. Not just thrown together in a room, but let's formally organize them. But he never had the idea that these were materials that should ever be shared with anyone. People didn't need to be reading about correspondence between kings and popes. Why would you ever want to do that? But yet, he had the foresight to sort of begin to organize those. And then, in 1881, it was Pope Leo XIII who opened them to scholars for the very first time. For a department whose name includes the word secret, there is a great deal of transparency here, and a great deal of willingness, professionalism, a great deal of willingness to help. I saw nothing but that when I was there. So, to the specific of our topic, the reason that these archives, this rich depository, is so important I hope you have seen, is their value to the maintaining, preserving, passing on of the primary historical record. All ages of history, all fields of history have benefited from these archives. Certainly, I have a colleague who has done some research, done a lot of research in the Napoleonic era. And I know that he has heavily relied upon documents that are not, if they're not held there exclusively, they are held elsewhere, and the church has maintained the record. But perhaps there is no period more than the Middle Ages that depends upon this depository. And I want you to think about why that is. Okay, so if you want to research something that happened in the 11th or 12th century, where do you go for a primary source? Considering that over 90% of the population of the 11th and 12th century were illiterate. Where do you go for the record? Just Google it, right? Letter from Geoffrey of Flanders to whoever? No, somebody said Wikipedia. Oh my God. The bane of my existence. Where does the historian begin to look for primary sources from that period when the illiteracy rate was such that the only people who are writing are noble or kings, royals, nobles, and churchmen? Okay? How many written records actually survive from that time period? Well, not many. Not many. And the overwhelming majority of those that do are housed, guess where? In the Vatican secret archives. So again, the entire history of 1,000 years is something that might not have been able to document at all. I got a little segue here. Have some of y'all heard me tell the story about my previous department chair? Not my current department chair, but my previous department. I can talk about him because he's gone. My previous department chair, who when I came to LSU Shreveport 22 years ago and I asked why there was no course in the catalog on the Middle Ages. Have I told y'all this story? There's a course, some of you have heard it. There was a course on ancient Rome, classical antiquity, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, at the 400, 600 level. And then the next course in the sequence was Renaissance and Reformation. Fall of Rome, 476. Beginning of the Renaissance, 14th, 15th century. So I'm like, where's the other 1,000 years? And he honestly looked at me and said these words: there is nothing in the Middle Ages that happened of great significance that cannot be covered in a freshman survey class. 1,000 years of history. Well, I'm still there and he's gone, and there is a course in medieval Europe. So we do get to deal with this great, it's a very rich time, particularly in church history. So you cannot, particularly in the Middle Ages, the historian is unable to separate the secular from the sacred, church from state. Many of you no doubt recall from last fall's series we did about these epic conflicts that take place between popes and kings that really define the entire Middle Ages, particularly the High Middle Ages, from about 1000 to 1300. So here's an important point of overview, and I want to sort of set up what we're going to do next week through looking at these incredible deposits of history that we find in these archives. Remember that the church was born in the Roman Empire. Does everybody know that? Okay, it's born in the geopolitical context of the Roman Empire. And what that means is that its earliest identity was defined by persecution and martyrdom. That's how the church was defined. It was in an environment of persecution. By the time of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, which is that transition we make after the fall of Rome, there is a changing character to the faith, a changing character to its identity, because persecution and martyrdom was no longer the norm. There was a need for Christians to find a new narrow gate. The narrow gate had been persecution and martyrdom. So what's going to be the new narrow gate? Monasticism. Men living isolated, ascetic kind of lifestyle, separating themselves from the world. That became sort of the new narrow gate that would define the medieval church. Much of what is visibly and identifiably Catholic to us today is medieval in origin. Therefore, think about it. What we can visibly and identifiably see as Catholic. The architecture that we love, right? The artwork we treasure, the beautiful liturgy and prayers that we have, the setting of many of our major feasts, all of these were medieval. All of these were medieval. So yes, all of this is to say that here at Midsummer, or a little past Midsummer, I'd like to explore some of those very rich medieval themes. Architecture, artwork, our liturgy, our prayers, the rhythm of life of the Middle Ages that is very recognizable to you in the church today. Using sources existing in this great, rich depository of history, maintained with great care by the church. So, what I want to do real quickly, and I have just a few minutes to do this, but I do want to real quickly go back over some definitions we've had before, just so that everybody will come in next week ready for the test. Okay, not really. The oral quiz that you all will have. But to lay out for you what we're going to be looking at in a lot more detail next week. The early Middle Ages, just to give you sort of an understanding of why historians feel the need to break the Middle Ages into three separate periods. And remember that nobody woke up in 477 and said, oh my gosh, we're living in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is something that we are only able to define in retrospect. We're only able to get to the other side into modernity, the modern era, and look back and see that this was an age that was between the fall of antiquity and the rise or the rebirth of that during the Renaissance. So that's why we call this medieval, this French word which means Middle Age. So the early Middle Ages is really defined by very specific things that separate it from the High Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages is when you see the ascendancy of the church. The church steps into the void of authority that was left by the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And I'm going to use Britain as an example of this because it is one of the furthest flung points northward of the Roman Empire, the province of Britannia. When the very first wave of barbarian incursions came in the year 410, the Roman Empire began to pull home officials and legions out of those areas that were the furthest point first. They would pull from those furthest areas first. So when the legions left Britannia and went, for instance, into Gaul or Germania or somewhere into Central Europe to defend the frontier, do you think that those Roman officials, Roman magistrates, Roman governors, tax collectors, do you think they stayed behind in an area that was unprotected militarily? No, they left. And literally people would wake up, and I'm not being dramatic when I say this, would wake up and have an absolute void of government. There's no government. The only person in a village or an area who was seen as having any authority, who could step in and settle a civil dispute or hear a criminal trial for that matter, was the local bishop. So you see the bishops beginning to step into a role of worldly, secular authority. And it's one of the ways, I don't know how many of you have heard of a book that's called How the Catholic Church Saved Civilization. This is one of those ways that is cited, is that the church did step into a role that was not its first mission, is it? To be a secular judge, to be judge, jury, and executioner in a criminal trial, to decide a civil case about somebody having stolen your cow. These are not things that bishops of classical antiquity would have done, but they step into this role. And so it's not surprising that you see the rise of the church into a worldly role. It happens quite naturally, and I would argue quite necessarily it happens. So the early Middle Ages is when you see this rise of the church because of the effect of the collapse of the imperial infrastructure. So the period of late antiquity of the early Middle Ages produces some of the most significant intellectual streams for us. Everybody remembers the Latin doctors. There was a test on this in the spring. Yep. St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, Pope St. Gregory the Great. 4 Latin doctors of the Church. What an intellectual contribution to the early Middle Ages. For instance, preserved in the Vatican Secret Archives is an original partial manuscript of Jerome's translation of the Scriptures, the Vulgate, assuring the survival of the Latin language beyond the fall of Rome. Another reason that historians who say that the Catholic Church saved civilization is because of the saving of the Latin language. You see, because the Scriptures were in Latin after the collapse of Rome, Latin was preserved as a language. Had the Scriptures not been in Latin, what would have been the need to preserve the language? But the most sacred text was in Latin. So the Latin language survived. And again, arguably one of the ways that the Catholic Church is said by many historians to have saved the very essence and the concept of Western civilization. It's going to be reborn during the Renaissance. The liturgical work of Pope St. Gregory the Great that's preserved in the Gregorian Sacramentary. Beautiful prayers that we still use all these centuries later, preserved in the Vatican archives. The great effort of that Pope to bring order and harmony and beauty to Gregorian chant. Some of those original manuscripts are preserved in the Vatican Secret Archives. So, yes, this was the period that witnessed the rise of monasticism, the end of persecutions, and again, all of this record. The last great ecumenical council of the Church, the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, the last time that the Eastern and Western Church met together in a council that affirmed our use, our veneration of relics, that affirmed our images and artwork in our churches, that affirmed classical ideals of beauty and aesthetics. Again, all preserved in those archives. By the time of the High Middle Ages, you've got conflict. Because guess what's rising at the same time the church is? I may choke up here, y'all. I'm sorry. We might be cutting this short. High Middle Ages. Forgive me. The church is at its peak of power. Why don't y'all talk amongst yourselves a bit? Get my voice back. Late Middle Ages, characterized by a decline and a decay, not just in society, but in the church. 1300 to 1500, most chaotic time in human history. We have war, 100 Years' War, bubonic plague, famine on an epic, unprecedented scale, and conflict at the highest levels of the church. We have a pope in Avignon, we have a pope in Rome. We settled the Babylonian captivity of the church by bringing the papacy back. Many of you will remember due much to the efforts of St. Catherine of Siena. Papacy moves back to Rome. And then we have 3 popes. So, again, an issue that's really not settled until the Council of Constance by 1422, which a church council had to step in and decide who was the authentic pope. So, all of this is to say that yes, former department chair, there is so much that happens in this period that still resonates in the rhythm and the life of not just the church today, but is evidence in secular society. Without this incredible archive and depository of the record of this, we wouldn't even be talking about. It's that dramatic. So, what we'll do next week is explore a lot of the things I just sort of teased you about in the Middle Ages, these major intellectual movements, these major liturgical developments, major points at which the church intersects with secular society. We're going to be looking at all of those through sources gleaned from these rich archives. It's a great way to frame a discussion of the Middle Ages. And I hope you will come back. And hopefully, whatever is blooming out there, do y'all know what it is? Because I have never had this problem with allergies before. But maybe I'll just dope up extra on Benadryl. Any questions? Yes, Lucy.
So if I'm standing and I'm looking at St. Peter's, where are the archives?
Okay, so if you're looking directly at St. Peter's, you would go to the right. You have to go through the Santa Ana Gate, which is, you actually step out of Vatican City and then back into it to get to it. There's one gate by which you enter. There are 4 checkpoints. The first checkpoint, you must surrender your passport to get your ID, and then the second checkpoint is just through the Swiss guards. Third checkpoint, actually 3 more checkpoints through Swiss guards to get into, and it is a huge courtyard. It's surrounded, there's a huge courtyard in the center. It's a massive complex of buildings. If you know where the Vatican Library, the Vatican Museum is, okay, it is actually part or adjacent to that same complex. But it's massive. As I said, 52 miles of shelving, of which you can really only see a tiny part. You're not permitted to go walk the hallways and just pull stuff off.
And they're still adding documents to it?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
We have often heard the term Dark Ages.
Right.
Is that the same historical period? And why would they call it dark? And I'm assuming now that that would have been a term used by your former department head.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Well, actually, the term was first used by an Enlightenment philosopher named Rousseau, who called the period immediately following the fall of Rome a dark age. And I think the reference was well intended, that there was a loss of literacy and learning. But what Rousseau fails to mention is that literacy and learning was preserved in the light of the church. And that many of those ancient manuscripts, ancient texts, were copied for us and saved in scriptoria and passed on. So it really wasn't a dark age. Dark in the sense that Europe sort of descends into a chaos that is going to be reordered and restructured in a feudal society. It's going to be the model for 1,000 years. Everybody know feudalism, where you've got the pyramid, the kings at the top, the nobles and the peasants are the 99% of the population. But dark in the sense that the empire was gone and learning was gone. Classical ideas about beauty and aesthetics were not gone forever, but would be rebirthed during the Renaissance. So yeah, I don't like the term Dark Ages. I understand in the context that the Enlightenment philosophers were writing. I understand why they would say that. They saw learning and literacy as the pinnacle, as the security of an ordered society. So, yeah. Yes?
Sure. What steps were taken to preserve these archives through the wars?
Yeah. So many of the holdings of the archives were hidden, were taken actually during, particularly during World War II, were moved into safe places. The only other time that I can think of that might have been a real threat, and that would have been during the French Revolution. But the archives seem to have been untouched during that time period. Unlike what I can tell you, for instance, about what happened in France to Sainte-Chapelle, where revolutionaries looted all of the relics and destroyed them, all but the crown of thorns.
So they were actually physically moved.
Right. We've been moved probably into these safe places, these bunkers, that are secret. Yeah. That are secret. Yes?
What is that picture of?
That picture right there, I took a few weeks ago. That is the inside of what's called the White Chapel.
Not that one.
Which one? Oh, this right back here? That is our full-size replica of the Shroud of Turin. hearing a lot more about that this fall. Anything else? Oh, that is the inside of the White Chapel in the Tower of London. This was a chapel that was built for the private use of William the Conqueror in 1067. Isn't it beautiful?
I thought we could take pictures in
You're messing with me, aren't you? Everybody was taking pictures because the light was coming in those windows so beautifully that day. You didn't get a picture of that, Ray?
there. No, ma'am, I kept getting yelled at by security telling me to put that camera down.
I'm sorry. I'll share my picture.
I got busted in St. George's Chapel a few times.
Well, they did tell you no photographs in there. Anything else? Any other questions, comments? Okay, I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much.